Good afternoon, everyone. Allow me to start by introducing myself. My name is Maram Al Maskati. I'm a graduate of Ahlia University, BS in Accounting and Finance, and also MBA from, again, Ahlia University. I have published my BS Senior Accounting, senior project in International Business Research in January 2013. And my current research is accepted for publishing in the International Journal of Economics and Accounting. And one more thing to add, I'm an external auditor in Grant Thornton, Abdullah. So this is the agenda. I'll be giving a brief introduction, the research problem, moving on to the theory of the study, methodology, descriptive and path analysis, and testing a hypothesis, and finally the conclusion. To start with, corporate governance represents the center of attention because of many scandals taking place in the world. It is argued that good implementation of corporate governance can help with the company's internal control and good decision making. It aims to protect the interests of all participants in the organization, such as the shareholders and investors. The need for it exists when the management starts taking self-beneficial interest decisions, therefore causing agency problems, and in which shareholders bear the cost of those decisions, known as agency costs. Therefore, a proper corporate governance must be implemented in order to regulate those actions. The voluntary disclosure is argued to be one of them. It's considered to be an important element of corporate governance. Organizations with strong corporate governance are likely to disclose more information. Studies in the same field have been scarce, especially in the GCC countries region. The theory supporting this study is the agency theory, which suggests that the corporate control system should influence the organization's environment. Management can feel the absence of governance, therefore they take personal, self-beneficial interest decisions, and therefore they conceal critical information from investors. Therefore, a mechanism such as corporate governance must be present in order to prevent those agency problems, therefore prevent agency costs, and increase the voluntary disclosure. This represents the theory of the study, which represents the dependent element and variable. Sorry, the dependent variable, and corporate governance represents the independent variable. The agency theory representing the theory of the study, with the managers and the shareholders taking those beneficial decisions. The corporate governance divided into 6 elements. That the ownership of the largest shareholders should not exceed 20%. The size of the board of directors should be between 7 and 13 directors. The ownership of the 3 largest shareholders should not exceed 50%. The board of directors should be independent, and there should be a segregation between the duties of the board of directors, the chairman and the CEO, and managers' percentage of shares should be between 1 and 20. While the voluntary disclosure was measured using a self-developed disclosure index, which was divided into 3 categories: the corporate environment, social responsibility, and financial information. Moving on to the methodology, the data collected was from the Bahrain board's financial statements of 47 listed companies. We eliminated 6 because some of them were closed, some of them were not non-Bahrainis, so we ended up with 41 samples. The hypothesis of the study, I have developed 3 hypotheses. Either there's an accepted level of corporate governance in Bahrain bourse or not. And the second one is whether there's an acceptable level of voluntary disclosure in Bahrain bourse or not. And finally, whether there's a relationship between corporate governance and voluntary disclosure, which was also which has 4 sub-hypotheses. Moving on to descriptive analysis, I will not take much time in this in details, but the first element of corporate governance characteristic, which is the ownership of the largest shareholders, we have found that 12 companies have abide by this rule, and 33 companies or listed companies have their shareholders between 7 to 13 board of directors. Ownership of the 3 largest shareholders, we found that 17 organizations or listed companies have less than 50%, and 12 organizations were independent in their board of directors. 41, almost all of them segregate the duties between chairman and CEO, and the property of managers, we have found that only 1 listed company has given their managers shares between 1 to 20. The company size, financial leverage, and company age, market capitalizations are additional elements that we have used in our analysis. Also, the Big Four is one of the control variables that we have found that 32 listed companies have their auditors one of the Big Four companies. The path analysis, using a median of 50%, we have found that companies with high corporate governance have small-sized companies, have low financial leverage, are younger aged in the market. Their auditors are one of the Big Four. They have high market capitalization and they disclose more in high corporate environment, and high voluntary disclosure and social responsibility and financial information, while those with the low corporate governance are the ones with the big-sized companies, the ones with the high total assets, and high financial leverage. They are older in the market than others. Their auditors are not one of the Big Four. They have low market capitalization, and they disclose low information when it comes to corporate environment, social responsibility, and financial information. Moving on to the testing of hypothesis. The first hypothesis which tests whether there's an acceptable level of corporate governance and in Bahrain bourse. We rejected the alternative hypothesis since the mean was over 0.05. The percentage we got was 47% of corporate governance in Bahrain. Even though we reject the alternative, which there is no acceptable level of corporate governance in Bahrain bourse, it is not considered a very low percentage, since Bahrain has a newly established corporate governance culture, which started in 2010. The second hypothesis, which tests the level of voluntary disclosure, we rejected the alternative hypothesis, which means that there is no acceptable level of voluntary disclosure in Bahrain. even though we found 50% as a percentage of disclosure, of information disclosure in Bahrain Bourse, it's considered high compared to other studies conducted in different regions, such as in Kuwait, it was found 19%, in Saudi it was found 31%, and Malaysia was found 31% as well. Moving on to the third hypothesis, which has a sub of 4 hypotheses, which tests whether there's a relationship between corporate governance and voluntary disclosure. The characteristic of corporate governance, the first one is ownership of the largest shareholder. We accepted the alternative hypothesis, which there is a positive relationship between the ownership of the largest shareholder and the voluntary disclosure. When the ownership of the largest shareholder is less than 20%, which means that the distribution of shares is varied. Therefore, disclosing information is a must. The higher the number of shareholders, the more the demand to disclose information. The second sub-hypothesis, considering the size of the board of directors, we also accepted the alternative hypothesis. There is a positive relationship between size of board of directors and voluntary disclosure. The size of board of directors being from 7 to 13 has a positive relationship with voluntary disclosure. The smaller the board of director, a small board of director is able to make better decisions, while a large board of director leads to less information transparency. The ownership of the 3 largest shareholders, we rejected the alternative hypothesis, which means there is no relationship between the ownership of the 3 largest shareholders, principal and voluntary disclosure. If the 3 largest shareholders hold shares exceeding 50%, it means that these 3 are manipulating and controlling the organizations, which means there's a chance of more information concealing. Finally, the independency of board of directors. We accepted the alternative hypothesis. This is very critical to reduce agency costs. There is no relation. There is a positive relationship between the independency of board of directors, principal, and voluntary disclosure. And after accepting the 3 hypotheses out of 4 sub-alternative hypotheses, hence we accept the study alternative hypothesis, which there is a positive relationship between corporate governance and voluntary disclosure in Bahrain Bourse. Moving on to the conclusion, we have concluded that there's a 47% corporate governance level in Bahrain Bourse. There's a 51% disclosure of information in Bahrain Bourse. There's a positive relationship between the principals, ownership of the largest shareholders, size of the board of directors, and the independency of the board of directors with voluntary disclosure. There's no relationship between ownership of the 3 largest shareholders and voluntary disclosure. There's a positive relationship between financial leverage, Big Four, and market capitalization with voluntary disclosure. And finally, there's a negative relationship with company size and age.